Good morning. Can you hear me all right? A very warm welcome from us as well to this wonderful Festival of Letters. Delighted to be here. I thought we'd just maybe to start off by introducing ourselves. Germaine, could you introduce yourself, or shall I just say that you are a leading thinker, academic, and writer, and it's a delight to have you to be sharing this platform with you.
Thank you for that. I wouldn't describe myself that way. In fact, I'm going to cause a tiny scandal by saying I'm a bit of a reluctant reader. And I wish I could persuade myself to read things that I really hate, especially if I've been asked to review them. It is always a bit of a worry. But I am, of course, a dedicated reader because it's my profession. But I don't read just anything. But it's also true to say that I read almost everything, and I can't stop myself doing it. On the train, I will read the back of somebody else's newspaper.
Next, okay. Is this working? Yes, yeah. I think so.
You've got to nearly swallow it.
Oh, right, okay. I'm not going to do that in public. Very significant.
I'm wondering why India is still so attached to this obsolete piece of equipment.
Anyway, I'm Karan Perlman. I work for a publishing company in the UK, Myriad Editions, and it's such a privilege to be here at the festival. And, you know, we've been invited en masse, and there's a whole group of us here, and I can see some of our authors in the audience. But it's a true privilege. It's also a privilege to be in Kerala, which actually has one of the best literacy rates anywhere. I think about 94% of people, probably even more, are literate, and it's almost equal with men and women. There's actually, you know, 96% men, 92% women. That's pretty equal. Could be better, of course. Jenny, you should probably say something a bit about who you work with.
My name's Jenny Brown. I'm from Edinburgh in Scotland, and I work as a literary agent. And I work with about 80 writers, and they're 80 writers of literary fiction, of narrative nonfiction, and crime writing. And in my past, I have been the first director of the Edinburgh International Book Festival, where I was for 10 years, and I'm still very associated with the festival. And I'm also chair of Bloody Scotland, and Bloody Scotland is Scotland's crime writing festival, which happens in Stirling. And I'm here from Scotland with two crime writers, Sandra Ireland and Lynn Anderson, who you'll be hearing from over the next few days. And I prepared a little something about why I read. And I want to just start off by saying there are very strong health arguments for reading. And neuroscience shows us that reading heightens brain connectivity, and it's the perfect exercise for our brain. It helps memory and it helps concentration. And it reduces stress, and even, they say, can extend our lives. Well, why wouldn't we read when we know that? Now, there's a wonderful quote from Albert Einstein, which I'm sure you already know. If you want your children to be intelligent, read them fairy tales. If you want them to be more intelligent, read them more fairy tales. But I want to just say a little bit about the joy of reading for pleasure. Can you still hear me okay about that? And remind you why it's so important. Story is the bedrock of our society, and it's telling stories is that thing that makes us human. I might, in my life, have only lived in my life in Scotland, but through my reading, I can see the world through different eyes and become, for a short time, somebody else. Then return to my own life, a little bit altered, but with greater understanding. And that is just what I wanted to say about why I read. That's one of the reasons I read, but I'm sure there are many others.
Me next, okay. The funny thing about having to work with poetry and choosing to work with poetry is that poetry is not so much a matter of reading as a matter of remembering. It's mnemonic poetry. It's meant to help you remember. ideas and concepts of some complexity, of even more ambiguity. And sometimes you can go most of your life knowing a poem and thinking, what does it really mean? There's a wonderful Shakespeare sonnet that I learnt by heart when I was about 11, because I was so fascinated by what it could possibly mean. It was the one that goes, "They that have power to hurt and will do none, who do not do the thing they most do show, they rightly do inherit heaven's graces and husband nature's riches from expense. They are the lords and masters of their faces, others but stewards of their excellence." That's not quite the whole sonnet, but I learnt this, and every now and then, when I was faced with a really difficult problem of bullying, for example, which isn't always done in an obvious way, where somebody has too much power over somebody else, and people say they have charisma. Does that poem describe charisma? Does it describe undue influence? Does it describe the kind of rhetoric that turns people into warriors for, let's say, a religion, that turns them into fanatics, that makes them capable of killing other people, or torturing other people, or raping other people? What does this poem tell me? It has come into my mind so many times when I was faced with the inexplicable challenge of human brutality. And yet it hasn't got a single figure of speech, hasn't got alliteration or anything fancy. It is completely plain speaking, and all its muscle comes from the tension within it. When it says, they are the lords and masters of their faces, that seems very strange. Does it mean you can never trust the mask? Well, we can think of plenty of dictators and plenty of public leaders who have been a mask that turned out to be murderous. In the end, also, you find yourself thinking, in some ways it strikes me as a very Hindu poem, because it embraces so many conflicting possibilities. And I guess this is why I love poetry, and why I've worked in it all my life, and why I will probably die quoting poetry. I certainly have a great friend who, when she was dying, we spoke to each other entirely in poetry the whole time. And I'm thinking, is poetry still alive in our society? Do people know it? Because it's more important to know it than to read it. You can read a great big long poem and end up mostly bored, as Dr. Johnson pointed out.
If you have you've obviously got a very good memory, and you can remember.
Not anymore.
Well, but you certainly recited a sonnet. I mean, I have a really bad memory, so actually reading becomes more and more important to me. And I mean, one of the things I regret so far is that I don't actually reread enough, and I'm often impressed by people when they say they're rereading a novel that they read when they were younger, and I think, sorry to use that word privilege, but that is actually, it's an amazing thing to be able to do that. And I know what you're talking about those memories of reading that you have, and it's wonderful to be able to quote them. I read, actually, I think I read mostly just to keep sane. I mean, if I didn't read, I think I'd go bonkers, which is probably what you were saying before.
But Corinne, it's interesting, isn't it? Because we each read for slightly different reasons for work. You'll have done masses of that, Germaine. And, you know, as a publisher, you are reading, and you bring a different set of sensibilities, don't you, to your reading when you're in a professional sense than you do, you know, as a private citizen.
Yeah, but do you find, I mean, I want to apologise to, I have two of our graphic authors here, graphic novelists, Sarah Lightman and Nicholas Streetman. I want to apologise because I think I'm quite a bad reader. And as soon as I have to read for work, it's not so much that I tense up, but very different things come into play, and I don't have that freedom. So it's wonderful to be able to kind of read without having any purpose to it. If I'm reading for work, if I'm reading somebody's submission, a graphic novel, or if I'm advising our publishing director, Candida Lacey, about some of the fiction that we might be publishing or non-fiction, it's always with, I've got to comment on this, I've got to keep my brain in a certain way so that I can feed back. And I think that it's sort of, there is a difference, and in a way that kind of reading for when you're completely open, I mean, it's what Keats called negative sensibility or something, when you're not actually doing anything but something seeps in.
Well, there's just one important thing I'd like to say at that point. You know, at literary festivals, there's always somebody teaching other people how to make a living as a writer, and they have their own ways of doing it. But they hardly ever say what I think is the most important piece of advice to anyone setting out, which is get an agent. Because the agent is the person who can persuade the publisher that this book has a future. If you do it yourself, you can't do that because you don't know the market. And that's the hard bit. Agents are harder to get than publishers. That's what no one will tell you, but it's the truth.
Yeah. My situation as an agent is that when I open my list of submissions, which I just do a few times a year, I will get, I don't know, I'm opening my list at 11th of February, and I know I'll probably get about 2,000 submissions in 2 weeks. And that makes me read in a very, very different way. And I know, because the pressure of trying to respond to people, and even just to say, look, I'm sorry, it's not for me, makes me read in this very pressurized way, because I'm only looking probably to take on 2 or 3 new people, 2 or 3 new writers this year. So I'm looking for very, very specific things. And I know I'm turning down some real gems. And it does make you read in a very different way to the way that I read when I'm reading for pleasure. And so my reading for pleasure, that joy I was talking about earlier, only happens when I'm on holiday, in that I've got my stack of books, and I've just, during the Christmas holidays, I probably read about 12 different novels and books of non-fiction that I've been waiting and longing to read for ages. And that anticipation sometimes of published work, sometimes makes you read in a different way, because I've been looking forward to something so much. There's a lot of expectation, and often that can then lead to a bit of disappointment.
Well, it's all, yeah, with the graphic novels particularly. I mean, I'm such a bad reader of graphic novels if I'm reading for pleasure, because actually it's half the time it's somebody, you know, they might be published by another publisher, or it's people, you know, people I know or whatever, and I've been looking forward to this work that's been years in gestation, and then I kind of like wham right the way through it and not looking at the art properly, sort of, I mean, really bad. And of course I have to go back to it, but I mean, I'm very, very conscious of that. That's also, it's not quite the same as like
I've written a book about a little frog, a tiny metamorph that is no bigger than your little fingernail, and I was very careful to get my biology right. I have a conservation program in southeast Queensland, and this was about a certain frog, a cascade tree frog, that is supposed to be extinct. It's not extinct, but it probably might as well be. And I decided that I wanted to do it as a sort of graphic novel. I just had one real problem. The artist I wanted was Albrecht Dürer. And he's just a bit expensive and just a bit dead. But you know that beautiful drawing of the hare by Dürer, and also there's a clump of grass that could come from any field anywhere, except that it's all meticulously observed. And it's my theory, see, that kids don't want standardized or stylized drawing. And I think they get sick of all these bright colors. that what you really glory in is detail, and you want more and more of it. You want to be able to mine right into the picture and keep looking forever. But as you see, it's a bit of a long shot.
Am I in the situation where kind of Germaine Greer is pitching me a graphic novel about a frog?
But I can't draw it.
I have to say that Germaine's sort of the female eunuch. I mean, it's actually one of the books that I even remember where I was when I read it, which was in a kind of horrible flat in Park End Street in Oxford with a friend of mine eating pickled onions and talking about it. And it's not, I sort of remember kind of where I was when kind of Robert Kennedy died and, the moon landing, and then kind of remembering eating pickled onions with the female eunuch is really quite something.
It's not a very good book. That's what you need to take on board. It was the best I could do at the time. But I think The Whole Woman is a better book. But ironically, The Whole Woman, you could say, failed. It didn't exactly fail. And another book failed that is dear to some people in India, which is my book called Sex and Destiny, which was about the cruelty of the population campaigns of the 70s and how they actually retarded demographic transition, which is, of course, something that India is, and Kerala in particular, is getting very close to achieving. This is a huge triumph. But I hear no trumpets.
Germaine, you were saying earlier that you tend not to read novels anymore. Why is that? What are novels not doing for you now?
Well, I'm going to be mean about novels. I'm going to be mean about novels, even about the ones you love. In a novel, you set yourself a problem. You have certain characters and you give them certain characteristics, and then you tell their story, and it turns out as you might have predicted from your list of characteristics. In other words, your novel is a determinist fantasy. It's a self-validating prophecy, and in a real sense, in too many novels, nothing can happen. The end projected at the beginning will come true at the end, and if it doesn't, people will object and say that it's inconsistent or it's out of character or something. And I just think, I don't want to read I don't want to read anything that didn't actually happen, which is a tall order because nearly all the non-fiction we read is about things that didn't actually happen. I don't want to read about things that didn't happen because I'm much too curious about the things that did happen. And it's not true, for example, that people can't change. People do change. We spend our lives struggling with the changes in the people we love and in ourselves, and yet the novel is not, in some ways, not even allowed to go there. And I think I'm just tired of it. I'd really rather read science, and science these days is becoming amazing, astonishing. And my problem with most of that is I can't really understand it. But that's when you hit the keyboard and you start asking questions. What does this mean? What does that mean? Is this true? And if, like me, you're working in conservation, the truths you learn change every day. We've made so many terrible mistakes. And today's extraordinary news is that cows' urine in the abandoned pasture lands, the wastelands of India, is responsible for more global warming than nitrous oxide. And that was just on the side of all this gossip about who hates who and what Rahul said to whoever. All of that was on every other page, and it became white noise after a while. And in the middle of the news, as has happened before, there stood a cow. Loved it.
Interesting what's happening with fiction. And in a few days' time, I'm going to be on a panel talking about the rise of autofiction. I don't know if have you got any thoughts about that? Like Knausgaard and Rachel Cusk using themselves and their own experience as narrators. And I suppose it's a kind of hybrid, isn't it, between memoir and fiction. And we've seen an increasing amount of it recently, and it's been seen as a kind of, I don't know, well, for the reasons I think you've been talking about. People are looking for things that really happened rather than made up.
Yeah, but we've got a problem there, which is, I think, that most women have one of those novels in them. And it's usually the first novel they write, and they often have success. And I really wish we could wean them off the autobiography and make them address war and peace. And not what I was wearing on that important occasion when I met the man who disappointed me. I actually don't care what you were wearing, even if you've told me what year it is and who the designer was. The memoir making is tricky. Now, some of you may know that I never cooperate with biographers, and I've had a few. And I've had even more people who stuck me in books because they thought I should be there, who'd never met me. I mean, the whole thing has become ridiculous. The literary me is an extraordinary creature, and there's a new one out at the moment in Australia, which apparently people like. I rely on them not liking them usually, but they're fun. And I'm just thinking, I'm a writer. I'm the least interesting person in the world.
But that's, I don't think that's true, because one of the reasons why I read is to get into the head of a writer. I mean, I'm like the mad fan in Misery, you know, when Kathy Bates sort of like cottons onto that bloke in the I can't remember who it is now, of course. But, you know, that sort of, I read because I'm a fan, and I'm sort of looking for a relationship with the author as well, whether it's memoir or fiction or even non-fiction. I'm sort of looking for I'm either kind of looking to be informed or educated, but I'm also looking for some kind of empathy, which I guess is what happens in fiction. And then when I've got that, I'm actually very bad, because I don't even want to share it, because I want that to be a special relationship between me and the author, that I really know them best. And if only they knew and could meet me, you know, they'd really find out.
What would you turn to most of all? Would it be fiction or non-fiction?
Well, I'm a hybrid person, you know. I mean, I publish a lot of graphic memoir because that's some of the stories that are being created, and they do, of course, they use elements of fiction in them too, and the art is actually, the art doesn't happen, the art is made up, it's created. So, I mean, it's definitely a kind of hybrid form. And I'm as excited by non-fiction reading as I am about reading. I mean, like just that amazing keynote speech that we've just heard. I mean, I thought, oh my God, I've got to get that book. I've got to read it. I mean, that's it. That's history. You know, that was history, which I mean, it was, and that was also speaking. I responded to that. I didn't read it, but it made me want to read the book. And that's why I read.
But it's one thing you do learn. When you see what happens to the families of writers who write their own account of the dynamic of their family. The family doesn't recognize itself. They are usually wounded. Some of you may have read a book by David Plant called Difficult Women, in which I'm a character. We were sharing a flat at that time when I was teaching in Tulsa, and I had no idea he was writing this book. And then when he'd finished it, he said, I'll show it to you, and you can change whatever you like. And I said, what kind of a writer do you think you are, that you would show me your account of me, which I won't recognize, and then tell me that I can rewrite it? This is idiotic. And he's a member of the American Society for the Arts and Sciences. I haven't got one of those badges. And then his boyfriend told me that actually it was a work of fiction. And I said, well, then take my name out. And then later on he told people that it was all invented, and now they don't talk about it anymore, which is a relief. I think this is a thing that makes literary festivals awkward for me, is that people think they know me, and they don't know me. And I make a point of trying not to know myself. I'm not interested in the subject. So when the biographers come along and say, can we ring you up every day and ruin your life and ask you to remember what happened at an event that never happened in the first place, and I always say, I'm not interested in your subject, and I've got a living to earn. I'm a writer, remember? They say, yes, but I've got an advance, they say. And I say, earn it and then spend it, but don't blame me.
Let's just talk a little bit about literature festivals, because they've become such a phenomenon, and it's fabulous to see how this festival has grown, just having had its inaugural festival last year. In Scotland, we are we like to think, most literature festival nation on earth. We have, I think, approaching 50 festivals for a population of just about 5.5, 6 million people. So extraordinary. And there are festivals from the big one, of course, Edinburgh International Book Festival, which has now got something like 1,000 speakers over 17 days, to tiny festivals on Scottish islands that might just feature 6 writers over 2 days. And I was at such a festival last year on the island of Colonsay, and it was absolutely delightful. And a very different experience to being at a festival with lots of writers. But it's interesting to see what's been happening in terms of reader response to festivals. Here you all are. Fantastic to see you out on this morning. And what readers are looking for from festivals. What do you think? What is it about festivals that is appealing to people more and more?
Sometimes I think it's instead of religion. I mean, it's certainly, there is that kind of, it's like a communion of like-minded folk, and it is great if you really get stuck into a book festival. It's, you're kind of with people you read, you're with people you might know. There does seem to be a kind of like there's a shared common purpose, and for those of us who don't have any religious background or affiliation or whatever, my goodness, this is sort of, it's almost like mad, it's almost too much. But I think that is, I think that it's kind of sometimes, kind of it does fill a gap, and I do wonder if in my reading, it's sort of the only it's not as if I meditate or anything else. It's only at the end of the day when I have to have a few pages with my book. I mean, I feel I go wrong if I don't have a book on the go. It doesn't even have to be a good book. I don't even have to be enjoying it that much. But it's just, it takes me outside myself. And I do feel, well, maybe that is my sort of religion. I don't know. What do you
But it's odd, isn't it? There was reading, as you're saying, is such a private communion between you and the author and the printed word. And then we come to festivals where it's far from a private communion. What do you think, Germaine? You've been to so many.
Yes, and I remember vowing after the first one that I'd never go to another one. I think it was the reverence that got me. Just, now a leaf's gone and dropped on me, so that's a blessing right there. But I can think of one important thing that a festival could do that it doesn't very often do. Now, I said I hated reading novels, and I don't usually reread them. In fact, I very often don't finish them. But there is one writer whom I return to again and again because I think he is the greatest prose stylist in English of the 20th century. Can you guess who that is? It's R.K. Narayan. Now, are you still reading him? Are you still printing him? Because all the little errors of style that you can hear in people's worked up addresses are purged in that perfect English. Have I suddenly been turned off by some underground organization?
Yeah.
Now, I'm so glad that you did respond so quickly, but do reread, because it is a curative against Salman Rushdie, for example, a writer who is a show-off and whose literary effects are, in my view, meretricious. And the other thing about Narayan is it's a very simple story, but real changes happen. People are transformed. And all this without any posturing. It's extraordinary and wonderful. You are so lucky to have him. Don't forget him.
Can we have some questions? We've got 10 or 15 minutes, and it'd be lovely to hear your questions or your observations about why you read or anything else about reading habits.
This question is addressed to Professor.
Oh, sorry.
In fact, you are from overseas. And my question is, why we have to read? Is it for lead? Read it to lead. Can you comment something on that? I want to read because I want to be a leader. or I want to lead.
I think it's a bad idea.
Correlate? Can you correlate, ma'am?
I think if you want to lead, you'd better not read too much. You're going to get muddled up. And you might start meaning what you're saying, which would be a colossal disaster.
Okay.
And you would get absolutely nowhere. Maybe you should think of Bollywood.
Yeah.
Maybe Shah Rukh Khan is the way to go.
Yeah.
But you'll need the hair implant.
Thank you, ma'am.
Great start. Another question here. Oh, sorry,
Okay,
here
okay.
and then here.
It's to ɡrɪər. Madam, you said that poetry is mnemonics. And also you said that you read everything you get, even eavesdrop a train traveler's newspaper. Why you are so fanatic? Are you a bookworm or a book virus?
I do read everything, but I don't remember everything. And generally, I read the back of somebody's newspaper, so I don't have to look at them, because they're quite often staring at me, and I never know. And you can see they're going, "Is she? Do you reckon?" And then they eventually lean across and say, "Excuse me, what is your name?" And I say, because I'm totally unhelpful, "Is my name what?" And just to avoid that embarrassment, I will read the back of your newspaper, especially if it's the crossword. Then I'm happy. Then I can avoid eyes for the whole trip.
Good morning. My question is something that I identified what you just said, that you pick up a lot of books, but you don't end up finishing it. I used to be a voracious reader, but of late, I go through half the book and I just give it up. Have you overcome that issue? And if you have, how have you done it? Because I want to get back into serious reading.
Well, I do serious reading. I must. And if you read my book on my rainforest, you would see that I've been reading botany, and I'm still not a patch of the botanist my sister is, but I have to be able to keep up. So I'm reading enough to understand what she's saying to me. And it doesn't always work, because she's much smarter than me, really. Throwing away, I think you should throw away a book if it's annoying you and you feel it's wasting your time. And you should revisit books that you think did something else for you. But they may not be novels. On the other hand, they might be. We could probably all do with reading Dostoevsky again. But have we got the patience? That's the other thing. Books have become more compressed. They've become more vivid. They're slangier. And so when you I cut my teeth, 12-year-old, reading all of Dickens, because I had a long train ride to school, and they were the heaviest books in the local library. So I bought books by weight, and I read and read and read and read, and now I'm ready to read them all again, partly to avoid the bloody BBC buggering them up so that I can't remember them anymore. I think that didn't happen. He didn't say that, and he never would have used that word. So back to Dickens, I say.
Hello, I'm afraid that book reading is becoming less popular among the young with the digital world. So I am sad that maybe we may not have the old books, but all on iPads or mobiles, etc. I would like to ask Germaine a question. I know you're not averse to controversy. Okay, two questions. One thing about feminism, okay?
One thing, okay.
Okay.
Make sure it's one.
What is your view of, you probably know what has happened around here with the entrance to the temple of women between the ages of 10 and 50, okay? So I know that's difficult. It would be nice to know what you think. Secondly, I know you've had a lot of slack for what you said apparently about the Me Too movement. What was that all about?
Oh, you're assuming it's over.
Oh, sorry.
No, that's probably a pretty fair bet, I think. What's going? Am I going to answer the question about the temple?
No, I'm just lining up the next question. That lady at the back there. Yeah, but
we've got a lady in the audience.
Yeah.
Goodness. First of all, I don't understand the legal background of this, because you have a secular power trying to control a religious institution. That's tricky for a start, and it needs to be worked out. And I don't think you'll work it out easily. Now, there are plenty of places from which women of reproductive age are excluded. The monasteries in Greece, for example. And then, of course, we have monasteries and convents which are sexually segregated. The reason in this case was not that the women were impure, but that the priests were supposed to be chaste. They were supposed to not, like Buddhists, they were supposed to have no sexual feelings at all. And the interesting assumption was that if a woman 50 walks into the temple, yay, somebody feels a sexual urge. I think that's a bit unlikely, but it could be worked out in court. At what point does this phenomenon cease? And there are plenty of men, as we know, in the priesthood who have never felt a sexual urge towards a woman. So they do sound a bit innocent on this one, but it's a good basis for a proper, civilized discussion. Because there is an issue here, and it's an issue that's been around as long as the human race. We have had segregation and no segregation, and we've had women admitted and then discovering that they actually have very little room to move and very little respect and can't get anywhere. It's like joining the police or the army. We're in the middle of this dialogue, and I think it's quite important that in Kerala, which has still a reputation for sophisticated and civilized interaction, that it happens here. I mean, Kerala is achieving great things in terms of modernizing without westernizing. And when I was in India in '70, this was my watchword. Don't become Western, become modern India. Oh, the Me Too, for goodness sake. Now then, let me tell you how that began. It begins in the southern states of the United States. It's an organization representing agricultural laboring women who had been subject to sexual outrage from their employers and people in authority over them. Set up by a black social worker woman who was working with them. Her aim was to raise enough money to let these women bring civil actions against the men who abused them. Now that is difficult because you have to find a lawyer and you have to pay him, and you have to be able to prove that you've actually been damaged, you didn't get a job, or you were hurt, or you got pregnant, or you got a disease, or something. You have to be able to show damage, and you also have to show that there was no contributory negligence on your part. This means you're practically certain to lose the action, and even if you don't, the employer is rich enough to appeal and bring another action. You could end up destitute. So she wasn't getting very far. I don't know if she'd raised any money at all. And then the next thing that comes up is a whole glamorous organization of ladies in designer dresses showing plenty of cleavage at a major event and stating to all and sundry that they'd been subject to sexual harassment. Well, chances are bloody nearly all the women in the room had been subject to sexual harassment. In India, this is a big issue because you know that for a long time it was a crime to name a woman who had been subject to sexual outrage because she was considered devalued, and her family was considered damaged if the matter became public. Now, the matter becoming public is still awkward. Me Too sounds as if you're boasting. Hey, I got raped too. Except that with poor old Harvey, I've seen men doing worse than that on the beach in Sri Lanka, what he was doing in front of women. You can see it anywhere. You probably see it on any beach around here. It's a childish, stupid, ugly, dirty thing to do. But he doesn't deserve to get locked up for 10 years. Mind you, if he was Bangladeshi or Sri Lankan, he probably would get locked up for 10 years. That's another aspect of the politics of rape panic. And we've done it before, again and again, dig out people from racial minorities who have no access to defense and then hit them with the worst kind of punishment. Whereas rape is a thing that's going on every night in every street in the country where any man has sex with a woman who doesn't really want it. That's really all it is. If you've got this huge landscape of abuse of women, you can't single out a single notorious case and throw him in prison for the rest of his life with no treatment, no attempt to debrief him. One of the things about the Obama rules on rape was you couldn't confront the rapist. You couldn't have the rapist and the victim talk it out. I thought they were at the same university. They're studying the same subjects. And you're saying they can't clear up this issue. Why did you do what you did to me? What did you think you were doing to me? We're working on restorative justice, but this is going to be just about the hardest thing to manage in the case of rape, especially with younger people where liquor has been taken or drugs or whatever. There used to be a threat by gundas in India that if you didn't cooperate in sex, they'd cut your nose off. That makes it clear to me that getting your nose off is worse than getting raped. So let's not get to the point where we start cutting noses off. We have a problem, but we should be able to deal with it.
Brilliant answer. Thank you very much. This obviously is a really urgent matter, but we're going to talk about reading.
I'm sorry to break this very interesting thread of conversation, but I'm going back to what you said about R.K. Narayan and Salman Rushdie. So could you please go back and elaborate with your clarity the difference between these two writers?
Look, I could say the difference is that one is good and one is not. However, I have to tell you that I'm under orders from Salman never to talk about him. So there's your answer. This is the champion of free speech, and he has sworn me to silence. Because I said that if an obscene poster showing women in the local service station had in fact been showing Muslims, they would have smashed the window, but the women would do nothing. That's what I said. But I got punished. I'm not allowed to speak about Salman ever again. Nah. I'm not giving him negative publicity, let alone positive.
We're going to have a last question here.
Yeah, just quickly. As writers and as readers, why we read, been really interesting to hear you guys speak about that. But who you read and what's the politics behind, picking up the people or the writers or the books that you pick up, to spend your time with. Last year, a lot of my friends were doing the whole, reading more writers from the global south, more queer people, more people of color, more women writers. So what's your politics behind, who do you read?
I think that's interesting, the kind of fashion in reading or politics or however you call it. I mean, right now, Myriad is publishing this year, we're publishing a new edition of Daughters of Africa. It's called New Daughters of Africa, and it's writing by women of African descent. And the first edition was published 25 years ago, and it seems this is the first of many books that are going to be published this year. There's a real interest in writing of women of African descent, A, women, B, from Africa. And also, I think that will go internationally. The worry is that if you have kind of sort of something that then becomes a fashion, you've got 10 other books on the subject and so on, that it won't be sustained. But I hope that this will kind of expand into a kind of a new, that many more women from Africa and Asia and so on will be published, not just kind of novelists, but also graphic novelists and so on. I mean, I hope there's a surge in that area, and that's certainly my interest in reading. So I kind of feel it's because people are doing it around me, and my interest is sparked. But I hope what one reads is, like coming to, hearing the address this morning and thinking, my God, why haven't I known? Just that expression, why haven't I known? Hearing something and actually being able to kind of read in response to that is fantastic. I just wanted to kind of mention one thing. I mean, you know, there's the sort of the comfort of reading, which I'm not sure how much we've touched on, but my mother has dementia, and like every day she quite contentedly sits in her chair for hours and hours kind of reading. Sort of, it could be the back of a breakfast packet or a bit of newspaper or something like that. But she's remembering what she's read before and how lovely it is to sit and read. And that gives her so much kind of enjoyment throughout the day. I think that's a kind of a wonderful thing to have. Sorry, that's not exactly an answer to your question, but I wanted to bung it in.
But I want to remind you of something, that the most successful publishing venture in the last 20 years has been 50 Shades of Grey. And women picked up that book without any prompting from anybody, and they read it from cover to cover. And even my assistant in my office has read the whole 3. And I'm being really silly, I guess, because I don't want it in my head. But I'm beginning to realize that I'm going to have to get it in my head or I won't know what I'm dealing with, because there will be many imitations of that. And for people who are afraid of electronic media obliterating paper, trees would be really glad of that. But remember that we've got Harry Potter, and kids who'd never read a book of 40 pages have read 1,600 pages or something. So the book has a wicked life of its own. What I object to is it's very often too heavy to hold in bed. I wish publishers would think about that.
I think it's really interesting what's been happening with the recent trends in publishing. And one of the things that publishers are very aware of is the definition of a heavy book buyer. Now, I'm a heavy book buyer. I buy loads of books. I'm sure many of you do too. But the definition in the UK has now reduced from buying over 20 books a year to buying 6 books a year. And now, if you buy 6 books a year, you are defined as a heavy book buyer, which means that those of us who do read, some of us are reading a lot, but some are not reading or buying as much. And a consequence, I think, of that is what kind of books readers are looking to spend time with. And I think readers are looking for books that give them information, even their fiction. They're looking to learn things from their fiction rather than just escapism. And for instance, in the UK, books like The Miniaturist have become very popular. A big reading group type novel which tells you, portrays 17th century life in Amsterdam, in Holland. And we've seen the rise of narrative non-fiction, or as publishers are calling it, smart non-fiction, brainy non-fiction, the sort of non-fiction that gives you a lot of information, whether it be science, conservation, history, whatever. And that's become just increasingly popular because people are just looking to get more value out of whatever they're reading. I'm not sure how that relates to your point about 50 Shades of Grey, but we'll maybe just skim over that. I've been told we're allowed 2 more questions, which is fantastic. We've got time for 2 more questions. Any more questions about reading? We've got one here.
I have often seen that, appreciation of a book depends on the mood in which you read it. So I would like your take on that.
Yeah. Actually, I have a theory that there's a year in your life when everything you read will be burned into your brain. Now, it might be something you had to do at school, might be The Cloister and the Hearth or Captain's Courageous, but there's just something about the cadence, the language, the speed of reading, because you're picking up speed as you get better at it. And the things you read in that year, and it may be later and it may be earlier, but that is your treasure house, and they will pop up when you're demented. I hope you're spared that fate. But one of my best friends was demented before she died, and she read every day the same page.
Yeah, same thing. Exactly. I think that's very true. It's not so much. I'm not even conscious that I read differently when I'm in a different mood. I just know I
Corinne, hold your mic up.
But I'm a pre. I'm a. Yeah. Oh yes, yeah, exactly. I mean, there are some. Oh yeah, sorry.
Yeah. Like.
Yeah, okay, I'll do it like that. Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting. I've spent a few days kind of like enjoying the backwaters of Kerala, and you know, the wonderful thing about that is the memories that it brings. So, like, of, you know, for some reason, kind of remembering reading kind of Adventures of Huckleberry Finn sort of years ago, and somehow the kind of the sounds of what's going on the far riverbank, you know, resonating with what I'm hearing now in the current day. And I think that's the kind of richness of reading, that you've just got it sort of adds layers to your life, and you know, you're kind of bringing that all the time. So there are kind of so many. There are so many moments like that, which they kind of accumulate as you grow old. And it's not even if you kind of remember what it is anymore. That's amazing. I'm amazed that I remembered that. Jenny?
I like Germaine's view that there's a year in your life that becomes really important for reading. And mine was when I was 25 and I came to India. And I started off in Delhi and went up to Kashmir, Calcutta, came down to Trivandrum, spent quite a long time around this area. And I travelled exclusively by rail. And I read the books, the biggest books I could find, because I had so much time for reading. And so in a Russian bookshop in Bangalore, I bought War and Peace in English. I read my way through Dickens and Dostoevsky. And that, any of those greats now, going back to them, I think about being on those long train journeys, sometimes lasting 2 days. But what an amazing experience to have that period of your life that you can devote to reading in that way. So that was mine. That was my year of reading. Any other questions? We had another one here. Last
I would
one.
like to know your take on formulaic fiction writing. Formula-driven fiction. That seems to be popular nowadays. I mean, most of my friends read formula-driven fiction books, like, for example, Dan Brown and stuff like that. I would like to hear what your take is on that, such books.
No take on my part, never read any of them. I started to read the first one, and it was such nonsense that I gave up on about page 16.
Formula fiction?
No idea what that is.
Yeah.
Well,
it'll do.
Oh, Dan Brown. Okay, right, Dan Brown. Yeah, no, it's so I'm almost kind of blind to some things. I mean, I just won't pick things up. I mean, I just have almost like amnesia about some titles and so on. And actually, I can't. There are some books that are just, you know, they're kind of plot driven and so on. I can't. I mean, you also kind of books like kind of groups of women on a barge, kind of like going in the backwaters and so on. And I might read something like that, but I think this isn't contributing to my life at all, and I resent it. And so I sort of have a strange relation with some things. I might, or like chick lit or something like that. I might read it, but it's almost, I feel sort of very awkward by it. It's all to do with the writing. If you can write in any genre or anything, and it transforms it. I'm sure if somebody sat me in a room with a Dan Brown book and kind of shut me in a room for 24 hours, I might have a very different opinion. But I'm sort of screening things out because I have to make choices all the time.
But there is a place for every sort of writing, whether we're talking about Dostoevsky or we're talking about Dan Brown. And although it's not my taste, it's like, I would always think it's akin to eating fast food. I don't like going to McDonald's, or KFC, all those brands myself. But, you know, there's a place for it. And so I'd be wary about, you know, denigrating it completely, because it's brilliant for lots of readers just to turn the pages. And thank God they're reading books rather than other forms of entertainment. Yeah.
Actually, some of us don't have to buy books, alas. We get sent them every day. And once a year, the Oxfam truck comes, and we put all the books in the Oxfam truck, And this year we made £1,900. So thank you, people who sent me books. I promise I always read one page.
Can I also just say that, I mean, I have very little difference in the format of the book I read. I don't mind whether it's on a, you know, on a Kindle or digital or whatever, or as a PDF. I read a lot of books on my laptop. And I think that, you know, just in answer to what you're saying in the 6 books a year, I mean, people are reading in many more forms on their phones and so on. I don't think reading itself is challenged at all, even if people aren't buying as many physical books. I mean, you know, kind of, there's hope for us when my 30-year-old nephew starts telling me about a book that he's reading. It must be the first book he's read, but it's like, it's a new thing, you know, that's encouragement.